Hi, everyone. This is Gary Price from Library Journal's infoDOCKET, and it's time once again for another open access interview. Today, we're going to be speaking with Heather Joseph from SPARC. Heather, could you introduce yourself, please?
I'm Heather Joseph, and I'm the Executive Director of SPARC, which is the short name for the Scholarly Publishing and Academic Resources Coalition, which is why we always go by SPARC, a lot easier. We're actually a library membership coalition based in Washington, D.C., but operating globally. And we're working on setting the default to open for research and education.
Could you tell us a little bit about your background, Heather?
Sure. Oddly, for somebody who runs a library membership organization, I am not a librarian. My background is in publishing. I spent 15 years as a journal publisher for not-for-profit organizations mainly, starting my career with the American Astronomical Society, but also with a little bit of time out working for one of the larger commercial publishers, Elsevier Science. So my background is really deeply rooted in the scholarly publishing marketplace.
SPARC was part of ARL, and I know that in recent months you've separated. Could you speak a little bit about how was SPARC organized and why you separated from the Association for Research Libraries?
Sure. We were actually started as a project of ARL, and so we were sort of organized as a kind of nested within that larger organization. And over about a decade and change of operations, SPARC really grew into more of an independent entity, really concentrating a lot on policy advocacy. And if you know anything about the rules and regulations of lobbying or policy advocacy, you know that there's a lot of different standards and barriers that you kind of have to live up to. So the impetus for SPARC kind of spinning off and becoming its own organization was to make sure that both ARL and SPARC had enough bandwidth to actually be able to work effectively, and we still work together on a regular basis. We're still, in fact, located in the ARL office building. So it's sort of like the child left the nest. We kind of grew up and became our own organization.
What about SPARC funding? Are you purely a membership organization? Do you receive grants, that type of thing?
It's interesting. At our heart, we're a membership organization, and for the vast majority of our existence, we have been primarily funded through our membership dues. But over the last 5 years, we have been very, very fortunate to also attract a significant amount of additional grant funding for programs. Mm-hmm. And we operate right now with roughly 40% of our, 60% of our income coming from dues and 40% coming to support additional programmatic work from foundations.
So, for example, would the Right to Research Coalition be part of, is that part of SPARC?
It is part of SPARC. It's our student coalition. It's a great example of something that SPARC founded through the assistance of the Soros Foundation, very generous funding from the Soros Foundation to help us get that started, and that coalition is now sort of up and running under its own steam.
Can you talk a little bit about how you're involving students with this coalition?
Sure. It's something that we're really proud of. The relationship between students on campus and our library members has been strong, but there was never really formal channels, I think, for students to be able to work with librarians on advocacy, policy, really sort of practical, pragmatic approaches to kind of changing the underlying rules of the game in terms of being able to get access to scholarly information. So we've actually created opportunities for students to work directly with our librarians and also to lead. We have a student and early career researcher position on the SPARC board. So we really do believe that students play a role not just because they're leaders of the future, but because they're important in the present as well. They're a critical constituency for us.
And I know a lot of our viewers would be interested in SPARC Europe. Are they part of your organization? How does that relationship work?
So SPARC Europe is a separate organization operating under the SPARC brand, essentially. So they have a different governance structure, completely different members, but we work very closely together, as we do with SPARC Japan and our newly launched SPARC Africa, to coordinate our operating agendas and our strategic priorities.
How is open access different globally? Are the issues, for example, that we face here in the United States the same as what's being looked at in Japan or in Africa or in Europe?
So that's a great question. I would say the drivers are similar. We share the same kinds of desires to have equitable access to knowledge. And at its underpinning, scholarly research is the building blocks of knowledge. So that notion that no one should be shut out from being able to learn, to being able to access knowledge, I think is pretty much universal. The sort of proximate causes or the drivers that will impel the movement in different countries are different at different times. So you may see, for example, a lot more conversation in the US with individual libraries talking about the cost of subscriptions to scholarly journals as a primary driver to leading us to want to explore an alternative like open access. Whereas in various countries in Africa, you may see the desire to really promote locally grown content as a driver. Open access really creates more equitable access to the microphone, if you will. And so I would say in many countries in the developing world, it offers a real opportunity for local scholarship to gain more visibility. So there are differences, but I think there are values at the core of open access that the community shares globally.
And I would imagine that funding is different as you go around the world. Funding issues are different as you go around the world.
Absolutely. And this is probably one of the most important issues in the open access movement right now. Is we've spent about a decade creating a decent amount of infrastructure in terms of creation of open access journal outlets for people to choose to publish in, to repositories to put content. And the question now really is, what are the economic models that work the best to support the full vision of open access globally? Right now there's a conversation happening in many sort of Northern European countries about the possibility of moving to a completely journal-centric open access system supported by article processing charges. That is a very different conversation than what's happening, and a reality than what's happening, for example, in Latin America, where the open access system is really predicated on local institutional support and communication of articles through repository networks. So this is really where the rubber's hitting the road right now in terms of trying to determine equitable, sustainable economic structures to support open access globally.
Are you positive that the funding, the sustainability is there?
I think there's an enormous amount of money in the system, right? Scholarly publishing, journal publishing alone is a $10 billion a year revenue producing industry. So there's a significant amount of money supporting the current system. Redistributing that money, reallocating, looking at where there may be places where we could, for example, not invest so much money into companies that throw off such large margins in order to reinvest that money back into the research enterprise or the research communication enterprise is where the challenge is. But yeah, I'm confident that the funding is certainly there. Finding the way to distribute it correctly is the nut.
You've talked about access to knowledge, and you also talked about publication. But open access is more than just scholarly publishing and print materials. Do you see images and video being part of the open access discussion?
Sure, and using the phrase access to knowledge is deliberate, right? One of the things that we try to be careful about at SPARC is to talk about the fact that we're not trying to simply shift the current journal publishing market in order to shift the market, right? Just because journals are expensive, yes, it's a fine motivator, but that's only a partial motivator. What we really are interested in doing is, for the first time, being able to take advantage of the communication mechanism that we have in the internet, right? That says we can share information in all kinds of forms in any media with anybody, anytime, any place. And yet we haven't really fully taken advantage of this phenomenal mechanism that we have. So we view open access as one strategy for helping to really optimize the system for sharing all of the components of research, education, building knowledge in a more equitable way.
When you talk to the academic, the professor, what are they looking for in open access? How can we get them more involved? I guess first we need to tell them about it, but if that's still an issue.
Definitely still an issue. Awareness, we work very hard on awareness, but we can always, there's always more people to reach. I think most people have a general sense of what open access is, and to a certain degree, almost everyone supports the idea of getting their work out to the widest possible audience with no barriers. That's great. That said, we don't have anywhere near 100% participation, because the main fears we hear from researchers, and getting to the heart of your question of what is it that they want to be recognized for the work that they produce. They want to be rewarded for the work that they produce, and rewards in the academic environment means funding, promotion, tenure. So right now we have a system that values certain journals for their title, for something called impact factor, the number of citations the average article in that journal gets. It's used as a proxy in funding, tenure, and promotion reviews. And so it's very difficult to convince an individual faculty member to choose an alternative, or something that they would view as an alternative to a Science, Nature, a Cell, a JAMA journal, which has that imprimatur of, if you're in that journal and it's on your CV, you're going to be recognized you're going to be recognized for it. So changing the incentive structure, really making an effort for institutions to value and to reward and incentivize publication in an open access journal, or even making your article open in an open access repository is really a key issue right now.
Do you find that sometimes this can all be too confusing for even the academic? Well, we can find the article here, here, or here. Which is the correct version? There's so many different versions of the same article floating around out there.
We don't hear a whole lot of complaints that it's confusing to individual authors. One of the things I think that's inherent in open access is you provide more opportunity rather than less. So right now it feels like faculty members, students, researchers are generally okay with a little bit of noise in the landscape, and I feel like it's a role for the library community where this is a place where we can really effectively sort of step up and use our skill sets to help make this information more uniformly discoverable and easier to find for people. It's not a huge complaint that I hear. It probably bothers librarians more than anybody else.
Well, in other words, I find a preprint version here. I find preprint version number 2 here. They're all, in other words, they're all showing up in the results that I'm seeing. Which one do I pick? What is a preprint? Is that okay? That type of thing.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. Yeah, I think there is definitely confusion over what can I cite. I think most people would go back to the article that's published in the journal, that final journal version. But as we see greater acceptance of the notion of preprints in other disciplines besides just physics, right, where this has been a long established part of the culture, things might get a little bit messier before they get neater in terms of understanding what is citable and what's the version of record.
And I guess this would be a good time to ask you your feelings personally, and perhaps if there are official SPARC feelings on altmetrics.
official SPARC feelings I think they mirror mine. We're very excited about the possibilities that alternative article level metrics present for really kind of presenting for the first time a much more robust picture of impact, right? Rather than simply using an average number of citations as the full measure of the impact of your work. I think everyone recognizes that the outputs of research have all kinds of different aspects of impact that you want to be able to talk about, and you want to be able to tout, and you want to be able to be recognized for. From, there are universities where it's wonderful if your work is recognized in the media, in the news. It's something that's valued. Very difficult to show that simply by talking about an impact factor. One of the things I love about alternative metrics and article level metrics in particular is the kind of eavesdropping ability that we have now through social media to see what kind of conversations are happening about an article or about a figure in an article or an aspect of an article on Twitter or Facebook or in academic social media sites like Mendeley or Site You Like, things like that. It's an incredibly innovative and new kind of opportunity to just to find out more about who's reading your work and what are they saying about it. What's the chatter? What's the buzz?
There is more and more open access material out there every day. And for a lot of people, it all comes down to one or two different databases to help discover it. What can be done to make so much more of this discoverable by the typical researcher?
One of the most compelling talks that I've heard recently was Herbert von de Sompel spoke last week in Vienna, and we talked about next generation digital repositories, open access repositories. And Herbert pointed out that oftentimes the papers or the research objects that are in our repositories are very difficult for Google Scholar and Google to discover and index. And to your point, whether we like it or not, a lot of searches start and end with Google these days for academic papers. And one of the things that Herbert has suggested the library community, the academic community think about doing is really kind of going back and retooling our repositories to better reflect web native architecture. And we didn't build repositories with the notion of search engine optimization in mind, right? There was no such thing as Google when we started building repositories. We have to go back and think about exactly what you just said, which is what are the tools that the average person uses to try to find this critical information and make sure that our platforms reflect that trend and give people the best chance to find as much as possible.
Something that we talked about offline a couple of weeks ago, I was wondering if you could share with others about the need to get people involved in open access and really academic research, at least make them aware of some of these tools before they begin using an academic library.
Yeah, one of the ideas that a young researcher actually brought to our attention at the SPARC meeting, in fact, a couple of weeks ago in San Antonio. She was talking about becoming a new faculty member, actually at the University of Vermont, and she said, we have to go to this thing called new faculty orientation, and she said there was not any discussion at all in new faculty orientation about open access resources that are available or valuing faculty making their work widely available through the repository. No mention there. And I loved her comment because it was such an honest comment as a brand new faculty member saying, and this is the place where you literally have a captive audience. We're too afraid to leave new faculty orientation. We're not going to leave the room until it's over because we don't want to miss anything that we might need to succeed in our new role in the university. And we really kind of sat up and took notice and said, these are the places where if these are values that the institution holds, this is the place that we should start talking to faculty members about them.
Would you agree that perhaps even getting into students at the high school level might not be a bad idea?
Absolutely. My son is 13. even at the level of a seventh grader, the research that they're being taught to do, they're being taught research methodology now, and how to do literature searches. They're trying to figure out what's a trusted resource on the web. There's absolutely no compelling reason to not begin to talk about issues of equity of access in K through 12.
Before we go, I'm going to really throw you an open-ended question here. If it was all up to you, Heather, what would be the next steps for open access globally?
First and foremost, I would like to see universities, colleges, research facilities actively promote open behaviors and reward open behaviors. Reward publication in an open access journal. Reward making data sets openly open and usable to anybody. Really incentivize people to change their behavior and say, look, the only way science, research, scholarship advances is if we share this stuff as widely as possible for people to build on it. And we're going to put our money where our mouth is and say that you're going to be rewarded for doing this, right? Rather than just publishing in a high-impact journal. First and foremost, because I think we get critical mass of participation that way. And then second, I would like to see funders say communication of the results at every phase is part and parcel of doing effective research, and making those outputs, those results, transparently available is what we're investing in research to do. And I would like to see their policies reflect that as a priority, and also their wallets open up and provide infrastructure that can support making data, articles, research outputs of all kinds openly available. So sort of only two steps, but I would say the incentive structure I would change quickly, and I would try to provide as much long-term sustainable infrastructure as humanly possible to make this last.
Heather, thank you very much for spending some time with us. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me, Gary.